Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some news out of the state of Wisconsin where Milwaukee County Executive Democrat David Crowley has officially launched his gubernatorial bid. Crowley is now the second major Democrat to enter this race following Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez in what is expected to be a Democratic primary field according to Politico. So the Wisconsin governor's race is very interesting as the incumbent Democrat Tony Evers has opted not to run for a third term, leaving an open race. Now with Crowley running, he is the second Democrat to enter, and this is going to be a very interesting showdown to see what happens. The 39-year-old former state legislator said he planned to lean on his record in public office, including cutting property taxes, to demonstrate he's, quote, the only candidate in this race that not only has legislative experience, but also experience at running a government. The issues we've led on here in Milwaukee County, I want to be able to scale those up to touch every community across the state, he said in the interview on Monday. So this is interesting news out of the state of Wisconsin because this governor's race is expected to be one of the marquee, most competitive races in all of the United States for 2026. And when you look at the recent election results, both at the presidential level and governor level, it makes sense why Wisconsin is one of the most competitive states in all of the United States. But first in the governor's race, David Crowley, the Milwaukee County Executive, now running, Sarah Rodriguez, the Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, also running. Three other Democrats notable Democrats have expressed interest in running include the former Lieutenant Governor and nominee for U.S. Senate in 2022, Mandela Barnes. He's expressed interest. Democrat Francesca Hong, a state representative from the 76th District since 2021, also has expressed interest in running. Kelda Roys, a state senator from the 26th District, has expressed interest, as well as many other Democrats as potential candidates as well, including Melissa Agard, Melissa Hughes, Josh Kaul, the Attorney General of Wisconsin, Cavalier Johnson, the Mayor of Milwaukee, Chris Larson, Tom Nelson, and Ben Wickler, all potential candidates as well. So the Democratic side is certainly very wide open. As for Lieutenant Governor, though, the Secretary of State, Sarah Godlewski, has announced she is running for that, so she'll be a candidate for Lieutenant Governor, potentially clearing the Democratic primary at least a little bit if she decided to enter that race. Now she's running as Lieutenant Governor and probably should not have too much of a problem at winning that and being the Democratic nominee. On the Republican side, for right now, it is also pretty wide open. Two Republicans are running in Bill Berrien and Josh Schoeman, though the big ball to drop for this race is going to be what happens with U.S. Representative Tom Tiffany of the 7th District. He's expressed interest in running for this race, and if he decides to run, he will likely be the Republican nominee. If Tiffany does not run, then it will be a completely wide open race, where former U.S. Representative and Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy is a potential candidate, as well as President of Wisconsin's Senate Mary Felsowski. We also have Eric Hovde, the 2024 U.S. Senate nominee, in what was a very close race. Rebecca Kleefisch, the former Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, serving with former Governor Scott Walker, is a potential candidate. The governor nominee from 2022, Tim Michels, and former Governor of Wisconsin, Tommy Thompson, who served from 1987 to 2001, and who also ran for Senate in Wisconsin in 2012, could be a potential candidate as well. So certainly for now, Tom Tiffany is likely the Republican nominee if he decides to run, and if he does not, it's certainly wide open as well. As for the general election in this race, it is one of the closest in the country, all being listed as toss-up from some of the top political prediction websites in the United States, and Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, Sabatos Crystal Ball, and Race to the White House, all having this race as toss-up. When you look at the recent election results in Wisconsin, it certainly makes a lot of sense. The last governor's race from 2022, Tony Evers won by 3.4% against Tim Michels, a lean Democratic win under 5 points. And Evers actually did better than expected based on the polling heading into Election Day. This was ranked as a toss-up and even lean Republican by Sabatos Crystal Ball on November 7th, 2022. The polling heading into it showed a very tight race, but with Tim Michels actually leading in the Real Clear Politics polling average by 0.2% and leading in the 538 polling average by an even larger 1.4%. So this is one where a lot of the undecided vote of that 3.4% essentially all broke for Tony Evers. And when you look at the final few days, most of the polls did show Michels leading over Evers in the final weeks, but the last poll from Civics did show Evers leading by that 3-point margin. And then as the polling suggests and by the election results, pretty much everything broke for Tony Evers, and Sarah Rodriguez when everything was said and done in that race. Certainly a very close one that happened in 2022. Back in 2018, this one was Democrat Tony Evers running for the first time against Republican incumbent Governor Scott Walker. And this was also a very close race in the Democratic midterm wave year of 2018, where we saw Tony Evers actually narrowly lead and flip this race from red to blue. So this was a very close race as well, very impressive one. The polling certainly split, but looked like Evers had a little bit more of a lead, but still a good amount of undecided vote heading into Election Day. Ultimately being very close, Tony Evers ended up winning. So the last two governor's races in Wisconsin, certainly very, very close. In 2018, being in a Democratic wave year, even though it's up against a Republican incumbent, it shows what a race could potentially look like in 2026. At the presidential level, we just saw a very close state. In 2024, President Donald Trump won the state by 0.86% against Kamala Harris in a very close matchup, including several close county results in places like Columbia County going 4.6% for Donald Trump. It's right outside of Dane. This is where the city of Madison, the capital of Wisconsin, is. This is obviously the city here in the county. Right outside here, these key suburban counties like Columbia, Sauk voted for Trump by 1.7. These two were very big signs that Trump was doing well throughout rural and suburban Wisconsin. Also, closer results in Iowa County, 7.6% for Harris. Green, only 0.27 for Harris over Trump. Rock voted for Harris by 7.3. And then it's also over here in Milwaukee, Harris won it by 38.4%, but also counties like Ozaukee, Racine, and Kenosha also putting up impressive numbers for Trump. When you compare back to 2020, you can just see in the map here, Columbia was a much closer margin by the numbers. Sauk voted for Biden by 1.7. Iowa voted for Biden by 13.7. Green was a 3.2% win for Biden. Rock was an 11.2%. And then Kenosha 3.1, Racine 4.1, and Ozaukee 12. As for the cities themselves, Milwaukee was about a 40-point win, and Dane was about a 52.6% win. So Trump made about a little bit of some inroads here in Milwaukee and Dane. So these are very important areas to potentially watch for in Wisconsin in the governor's race. Now, prior to 2024, Door County in Wisconsin held a record of accurately predicting the winner at the presidential level. Back in 2020, Joe Biden won the county. 2016, Donald Trump won the county. 2012, Barack Obama won it. And so far and so forth, going back for a while. So, doesn't have the streak anymore after Harris won this county and Trump won it in 2024. But that could be something interesting to watch for as well, as we're going to see what the election results end up looking like. So those are some key areas to watch for in Wisconsin for this race. As for the predictions right now for 2026, Wisconsin is one of the 5 governor's races I currently have in the toss-up category. Right now, if I had to make a prediction, I think this race is going to be very close, so much so that I have the margin of victory right now right around 1 point, a little bit under. But I do think the Democrats do ultimately narrowly win this governor's race, and a large reason being the election environment for 2026 should be favoring the Democrats in a similar way to what 2018 did. It's possible Republicans do a little bit better than they did in 2018, but I think the Democrats are on track to have a overall very good midterm election night. And I think even in a very competitive race, Wisconsin ultimately does end up going very narrowly for the Democrats. So that is all I have for you in today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy watching this video, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we have a new poll out of New York City to talk about the New York City mayoral race, and let's just get right into it. A new poll released by the New York Times and Siena shows that Democrat Zohran Mamdani has 46% of the vote to independent candidate Andrew Cuomo's 24%, Republican Curtis Lewa has 15%, and incumbent independent mayor now, Eric Adams, has 9%. This poll was conducted between September 2nd and 6th and has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.4%. Okay, so this poll is very interesting. And I typically don't talk too much about margin of error in a lot of my videos, but this is very significant because that plus or minus 4.4%, the way the margin of error works is you can essentially add the margin of error to a candidate going up or going down. So that plus or minus 4.4%, you could say that it's also Cuomo's doing better than that 24% and Mamdani is doing worse. You could also say Zohran Mamdani is doing better. Plus or minus 4.4%, you could theoretically get Zohran Mamdani up to 50.4% based on these numbers, and that would essentially mean the primary is over and there's no chance at stopping him. So that is very significant as well, that he's into the mid 40%. But this poll certainly shows some good numbers for Zohran Mamdani. It also shows he is gaining a larger percent of support in the current race. Now, a very important aspect of this poll they did was a head-to-head of Mamdani versus Cuomo if the other two candidates, Curtis Sliwa and Eric Adams, dropped out of the race. And that showed a much closer race with Mamdani at 48%, Cuomo 44%. This won a margin of error of 3.6. So even still, if you added the 3.6% for Cuomo to get up to Mamdani's numbers, Cuomo would still be falling a little bit shy of Mamdani. So this poll is very interesting and is obviously the most recent poll that we have in the 2025 New York City mayoral election. It's also the first one that has been conducted since independent Jim Waldron has dropped out of the race. So my interpretation of this poll is that things are relatively pretty much the same. If not anything, Zohran Mamdani's chances of winning have actually gotten a little bit higher in this poll. The way the race is currently going, with 4 candidates in the race, Mamdani, Cuomo, Sliwa, and Adams, all but guarantees Zohran Mamdani will be the next mayor of New York City. With the 4 candidates in the race and the anti-Zohran Mamdani vote being split, 24% for Cuomo, 15% for Sliwa, and 9% for Adams, with all 3 of them in the race, there's no mathematical way to catch Zohran Mamdani. It's just not possible. 5% of respondents in the poll did say they were undecided, so that is a significant number. But even if you added 5% to Andrew Cuomo's numbers, that would get him to about 29%. And again, you could add that 3.6% in the margin of error as well if you really wanted. That would get him up to about 32, 33%. He's still not close enough to Zohran Mamdani in the way the race is currently going to have a realistic chance at winning. The numbers just are not there. Now, in the head-to-head matchup of Cuomo versus Mamdani, it appears to be a different race, where it's only 4 points separating Cuomo and Mamdani, with still 7% undecided, and when you throw in that margin of error of 3.6%, it's easier to imagine a scenario of Andrew Cuomo possibly defeating Mamdani in that scenario. But again, I do want to caution this, that just because it becomes a head-to-head race of Mamdani versus Cuomo, that doesn't actually guarantee Cuomo could win the race. Mamdani could still defeat Cuomo in the head-to-head, and based on this poll, he still is. At 48 to 44%, let's just take the margin of error out of it and assume the polling numbers are correct. That's 7% undecided. Cuomo is down by 4 points. So of that 7%, not only does Cuomo have to win 4% of that 7 just to tie Mamdani, Mamdani essentially can only win about 1% of those undecided votes for Cuomo to be able to win. Because in the head-to-head, if Mamdani wins 2% of that 7% or so, that would get Zohran up to about 50%. Cuomo, being at 44, that would leave only 5% undecided left. If you won all 5, that would get him to about 49%. So based on the way this poll and the results were done, the math really isn't there as well for Cuomo to beat Mamdani. So in a head-to-head race, it's certainly closer. Cuomo has the best chance of defeating Mamdani based on the current polls and polling numbers that we've seen based on this one. But Zohran Mamdani is in a very strong position to be elected the next mayor of New York City. And whether it's a head-to-head matchup against Andrew Cuomo or a 4-way race that it currently is right now, Mamdani seems to be in a very strong position to do so. Now look, it also did a matchup of Mamdani versus Eric Adams, and this also continues to show a previous trend that we've seen, which is when it's a head-to-head between Mamdani and Eric Adams, it is not even close. Mamdani's winning by about 20 points, 55% to 36%, showing that Eric Adams in his favorability rating, or I should say lack of favorability rating, continues to show a clear trend in the polling data across every poll, really, that we've looked at, that Zohran Mamdani would beat Eric Adams in a head-to-head every single time. Now, the race is getting very interesting as we've crossed Labor Day, and we're coming up a little bit more into the general election season for this New York City mayoral race. We've seen President Trump reportedly be having behind closed doors conversations and such with Eric Adams, trying to get him out of the race and potentially to endorse Andrew Cuomo to try and stop Zohran Mamdani. Trump made a comment about not wanting to see Mamdani be the next mayor of New York City. And even if Trump is able to get Adams out of the race, Adams in this poll currently has about 9% support. Let's say Andrew Cuomo wins that 9%. That would bring Cuomo up to about 33% or so. Without that 3.6% margin of error playing a factor here, Cuomo would still be losing to Mamdani by about 13 points. So Adams leaving the race alone isn't really enough. And if you won every one of those undecided voters, that would still lead Mamdani leading over Cuomo by about 8 points. The math simply is not there for this race to be competitive with more than 2 people in it for the anti-Zohran Mamdani vote. It really is just a testament to how well a first-time, I would say, well-known candidate, or a first-time candidate that did a grassroots campaign and won the Democratic primary like Zohran Mamdani so far in the polling is really doing. Because he is taking on a former governor of New York, the current mayor of New York City, and the Republican nominee for the mayor in 2021. And Mamdani thus far seems to have the polling essentially on lock for this general election. So it's a very fascinating situation that's happening in New York City right now. Now, Curtis Sliwa and Eric Adams, for their parts, we've been talking a lot about Cuomo and Mamdani in a head-to-head matchup. Adams and Sliwa have both been very adamant that they are not dropping out of this race, that they believe they can defeat Zohran Mamdani, and that they don't trust Andrew Cuomo, and Andrew Cuomo should be the one to drop out of the race. Now, this poll did not go over what a Mamdani versus Sliwa matchup would look like, and not a lot of the polls do that. The last poll I could find that did a Sliwa versus Mamdani matchup was back in the Wick poll from July and showed similar numbers to the Adams number, or similar numbers to the Eric Adams poll, where it's 53-35 for Mamdani versus Sliwa. So Curtis Sliwa is saying he deserves to be the candidate to defeat Mamdani, but he's really in no better of a position than Eric Adams is to take him on in the general election. So this race is very fascinating because given how democratic New York City is, we don't usually see races like this one that are actually very competitive. Because essentially this race, yes, Cuomo and Adams are both running as independents, but when it comes to their political beliefs, you essentially have 3 Democrats in Mamdani, Cuomo, and Adams running against each other, and then 1 Republican in Curtis Sliwa. So the Democratic vote essentially is being split between Zohran Mamdani supporters, Andrew Cuomo supporters, and Eric Adams supporters. And then you have 15% going for Curtis Sliwa. So based on the vote where Sliwa, I believe, got around 25 or 26% in 2021, there is a good number of Republicans that are likely going to vote for either Andrew Cuomo or Eric Adams in this race that voted for Sliwa last time in the hopes of stopping Zohran Mamdani from becoming mayor. But again, this race is currently looking, and I can't understate this enough, Zohran Mamdani is going to win this New York City mayoral race unless something very significant changes. And what that would be both Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa dropping out of the race. Eric Adams dropping out of the race will probably lesser the margin of Zohran Mamdani's lead against Andrew Cuomo, but with Sliwa getting anywhere from 10 to 15% or so, the math is not there for Cuomo to try and reach Mamdani's numbers. And Curtis Sliwa does not have any chance at getting to Zohran Mamdani's mid-40%. So if the race becomes a 3-way race between Cuomo, Mamdani, and Sliwa, it's closer, but Mamdani would still win. The only way this race is not a guaranteed Mamdani win is if it becomes a Mamdani versus Cuomo head-to-head matchup, where this poll shows Mamdani leading by 4. As the article mentioned, the Tolkien research poll showed Cuomo leading by 11. So that one, there is a little bit of a disparity there on which candidate does what. Now, the August Gotham Polling Analytics poll showed, and I believe this poll is sponsored by AARP New York, that Mamdani would lead over Cuomo by about 11 points there. Now, it is 27% undecided, but still, that is a situation where there is enough undecideds to sway it, but Mamdani is leading. So it's very fascinating. This race is very, very fascinating. I think more likely than not, we're going to see Zohran Mamdani become the next mayor of New York City. Both polling averages from Decision Desk HQ in Real Clear Politics have Mamdani leading by around 14.5 to 15 points. Certainly well enough with the way the race is currently going to become the next mayor of New York City. The question will be, does any significant movement happen from Eric Adams or Curtis Sliwa over the next 2 months or so that may impact the results of this race? Because in this current form, I think the polls are correct, and we're going to see Mamdani win by around that 14-point margin or so. With Adams or Sliwa potentially dropping out, I think we'll see the race get closer. Mamdani, I think, wins by around 8 to 10 points or so. If Adams or Sliwa both drop out, then things would get a lot closer between him and Cuomo. At that point, I think Mamdani has a slight advantage, probably about like an under 5-point win, but Cuomo certainly could win the race in that scenario. Though in that point, we saw what the Democratic primary looked like, where Mamdani was able to get a lot of support consolidated and essentially get a lot more voter turnout than Cuomo did. So I think it does still narrowly go that way, but Mamdani versus Cuomo, there's certainly a chance that Cuomo could win that. But for right now, I still think more likely than not, Zohran Mamdani is the next mayor of New York City. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on this video and any other videos, ideas you would like to see me go over. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a new video out of the state of New Hampshire and it's very competitive, potentially, U.S. Senate race. Okay, so a little bit of backstory here is that for a while, the New Hampshire Senate race looked like it could potentially be competitive with the former governor of the state, Chris Sununu, looking at running for this Senate race. Now, ultimately, some very big news happened earlier in the year that the incumbent Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen would not be running for re-election. She would not be running, and it would be an open race. Now, other news happened about a month later, which is that Chris Sununu decided he would not be running for this race. And then at that point happened, the first congressional district's representative, Chris Pappas, a Democrat, announced he was running in the race. And Pappas very quickly got the endorsement of New Hampshire's top Democratic leaders, including the U.S. Senators Maggie Hassan and Jeanne Shaheen, and fellow Representative Maggie Goodlander. Pappas has this Democratic primary completely locked up and will be the Democratic candidate. Now, on the Republican side, things were a little bit more up in the air, with former Massachusetts Senator and Republican Senate candidate in New Hampshire in 2014, Scott Brown, as the leading Republican candidate. Until about last week when some news broke that former United States Senator from New Hampshire and brother of the former governor, Chris Sununu, John Edward Sununu, John E. Sununu, is reportedly considering running for the 2026 New Hampshire Senate race. And in this article reported today, we have a first poll from this Senate race, and what potentially shows it could be competitive. Now, this poll was commissioned by a top Senate Republican outside group. So what you have to listen to what these numbers that I tell you and definitely take it with a grain of salt here, because this is a Republican poll, and usually when the partisan polls are taken, they're making their candidate or their party's preferred candidate look a lot better. The rule of thumb I have is assume usually about a 4 or 5 point margin shift in the other candidate's favor. So again, just take that with a grain of salt. But it shows that Pappas would lead Sununu 45 to 43% in the initial head-to-head contest in the Granite State, per a memo circulated by One Nation, the Senate Leadership Fund aligned group. Quote, if Sununu runs, Chris Pappas will be in for the fight of his political career, the memo touts. This memo is notable because it comes from a group with close ties to Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and is the clearest sign yet that the GOP leaders in Washington aren't exactly excited about former Senator Scott Brown, who is already in the GOP primary, and his chances at defeating Pappas in this race. Now, this poll was conducted from 1892 polling, surveyed 500 likely voters, and was in the field from September 2nd to 4th with a margin of error of 4.4%. Okay, so now let's get to the polling in this race that we already have, which is thus far for Chris Pappas versus Scott Brown. The only poll we have comes from the local college in Manchester, the city of Manchester in New Hampshire, St. Anselm College. This is where the New Hampshire Institute of Politics is, and along with UNH, is kind of the top pollster for New Hampshire. And it shows that Pappas is leading Scott Brown right now by about 11 points. 48% for Pappas, 37% for Scott Brown, 15% undecided. Now, for this race, I do think this race will definitely be a lot closer than this result when everything is said and done. That 15% undecided is certainly very notable. It should also be worth noting that Scott Brown has not run for New Hampshire office since 2014, and obviously he was the senator from Massachusetts back in 2012 when he lost to Elizabeth Warren, and he was called a carpetbagger in the 2014 race. So sure, a lot of New Hampshire voters are going to hold that against him, but still when everything is said and done, based on recent election results, Scott Brown will be getting more than 37% of the vote in the general election, no doubt about it. But still, an 11-point lead for Chris Pappas at this current point in time is not something Republicans are going to want to see. Now, this poll with Chris Pappas versus John Sununu, even though it is a Republican-affiliated poll, this is the closest race we've seen with any matchup involving Chris Pappas thus far. The early polling for Jeanne Shaheen and Chris Pappas versus Chris Sununu showed Sununu actually leading over Pappas in the Qantas Insights poll, but again, that was also a more Republican-affiliated pollster. So though Sununu was leading by about 9 points or so, in that Republican poll, we also have to take it with a very big grain of salt. But at very least, it showed Sununu could potentially beat Chris Pappas. Whereas against Jeanne Shaheen, it also looked like Chris Sununu could beat Jeanne Shaheen. But again, Sununu is not running. But John Sununu potentially could be. And this is the closest we've seen. Jeanne Shaheen versus Scott Brown, when that poll was conducted, showed about a 10-point lead for Shaheen. For Jeanne Shaheen versus Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut, Shaheen was leading by about 18 points. Certainly not very close. Pappas versus John Sununu, though, is the closest we've seen for a Republican against Pappas. Now, at 45% to 43% with 12% undecided, everything could still ultimately go Pappas's way, and it could end up being a big Democratic win. That's certainly possible. It's also worth noting that with a Republican-aligned pollster, if we took the rule of thumb that I said, which is about a 4 or 5 point move in the Republicans' direction in this very specific example, well, that could mean that Sununu could go down to even 38% or so, or Pappas could even move up to about 50%. But again, that's more hypothetical for what that could look like in the election. But this poll, at least so far, is the clearest example that John Sununu probably gives the Republicans a better chance in this race at winning the general election against Chris Pappas than Scott Brown does. Where Brown's starting out at 37%, St. Anselm College is not a partisan poll, so it's not Democratic or Republican friendly, whereas this poll is Republican friendly, so it'd be interesting to see if St. Anselm does a poll in the next month or two regarding John Sununu's chances. That would be very helpful for this race to see how that changes things, but I would bet we would see Sununu starting with a higher floor of support against Chris Pappas than Scott Brown would have, especially given how the Sununus have done in New Hampshire politically, especially with Chris Sununu starting in 2016. One thing the article said, which is that John Sununu gives Chris Pappas potentially the hardest fight in his political career yet. That I honestly do believe is true. And the largest reason being is how Chris Pappas has won his recent races. This district right here, New Hampshire's 1st congressional district, is listed on the Cook Political Voting Index as a Democrat +2 district now. Back in 2023, it was listed at even, not a Republican or Democrat advantage. Now it's Democrat +2. But Chris Pappas won it by 8 points in 2024 against the Republican Prescott. He won it in 2022 against now Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt by 8.1%, the exact same margin. Back in 2020 was the toughest fight Pappas had in this race against the Republican Matt Mowers, where Pappas won it by 5 points. Again, a likely Democratic win in this even to Democratic district now. In 2018, he won it by 8.6%. So Pappas, the lowest margin of victory he's gotten in his career as a congressman in New Hampshire was in 2020, where he won by 5.1%. So could the race for Pappas versus Sununu be less than 5 points? That's the question for the Senate race. Now, New Hampshire is a very interesting state because New Hampshire always kind of has the potential of being a very competitive state that can go to the Republicans, but the Democrats have had a very steady voting history here at the presidential level and Senate level for a pretty long time now. It voted for Kamala Harris by about 2.8% in 2024. Now, it was very close, much closer than the polling, and myself personally predicted this race to be at 2.8%. Large reason being, Hillsborough County and Rockingham County, two of the largest in the state by population. Rockingham voted for Trump by 2.4% after it voted for Joe Biden by 2.1% in 2020. Now, Hillsborough ended up voting for Harris by 2.9%. Back in 2020, it voted for Biden by 7.7%. And based on the population of Hillsborough, there's an interesting phenomenon that happens here, where the percentage wins in Hillsborough County almost exactly mirrors the results statewide. 7.7% in Hillsborough in 2020, Biden won by 7.4. As I just showed you, New Hampshire voted for Harris by 2.8, Hillsborough voted for Harris by 2.9. In 2016, Trump won Hillsborough by 0.2%. The state only voted for Hillary Clinton by 0.37. So Hillsborough always seems to only be about half a point or so off of the actual margin result of the statewide total. So when you're looking for 2026, Hillsborough County could be a very important one to watch for in terms of an indicator of how this race could be going. But New Hampshire, for the most part, has been a leaning Democratic state, but has been one that has pretty consistently voted for the Democrats. The last time it didn't was back in 2000 when George Bush defeated Al Gore here by 1.3%. And it should be worth noting, Ralph Nader got 3.9%, and Gore only got 46.8%. Bush won 48.07% of the vote. Now, in 2004, even though Bush got a higher percent of the vote at 48.83%, he still lost the race by 1.4%. The Republicans in the last few presidential elections have not been able to get back to that 48% number. Trump got 46.4% in 2016. He got 45.36%, and 2024 was the best Trump and a Republican has done in a while, getting 47.9% or so. So the presidential race, though it's been close, Republicans have not been able to break that 48% threshold. At the Senate level, it's been a little bit different, but also recent history has looked pretty bleak. In 2022, Maggie Hassan defeated the Republican Don Bolduc by about 9.1%. Bolduc only getting 44% of the vote. In 2020, the Republican Corky Mesner got blown out by Jeanne Shaheen, 15.6%. Mesner only got 41% of the vote. Now, the good news for the Republicans in New Hampshire was that Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, who is now the governor, she did ultimately narrowly lose in 2016, but she was able to get 47.84% of the vote. Now, it looks like based on how New Hampshire's voted recently, her 2010 red wave year win in the Senate race looks like to be more of an outlier than the norm in New Hampshire, but it shows a competitive Senate race can happen in the Granite State for the GOP. But it hasn't really happened in a pretty long time. 2014, Jeanne Shaheen versus Scott Brown. Scott Brown got 48.21% against Shaheen. Now, this is interesting because technically this is the most recent Senate race that the Republican has gotten the highest number. Brown getting up to 48.21. This was also a very Republican midterm year. So Sununu is going to have to do something that has not been done since 2010, where Kelly Ayotte got 60.1% of the vote, which is have a Republican win the Senate race in the Granite State. Now, for Sununu's own right, he lost the Senate race in 2008 against the Democrat Jeanne Shaheen by 6.3%. It should be worth noting Sununu actually did do about 3 points better than John McCain did in New Hampshire in the 2008 year when President Obama and the Democrats pretty much won basically everywhere. So Sununu did do slightly better in that one. And he won his first Senate race in 2002 against, guess this, Jeanne Shaheen by 4.4%. So if he does become the Republican nominee against Chris Pappas, it's not like Sununu has not run in tough Senate races in New Hampshire before. He certainly has. This time around, Sununu has the advantage of having his brother Chris serve as the governor for many years, since about 2016. Now he's not the governor, Kelly Ayotte is, but Sununu won by 15.5 points in 2022. He won by 32 points almost in 2020. He won by 7 points in 2018, and he was elected in 2016 by 2.3%. So his brother actually may have provided the roadmap for what a Republican winning in New Hampshire could look like. Now look, this is a Republican poll. So even though the numbers do look good for John Sununu, there's still 12% undecided in this poll, and it is a Republican affiliated pollster. So the results are probably amping up Sununu and depressing Pappas's numbers at least a little bit by a few points, and there's still a good percent of undecided vote. At 43%, like the results I showed you, Sununu would be getting around the same amount of support that Don Bolduc did. So the question would be, not that John Sununu can't win, but can Sununu get up to the numbers like Scott Brown did, getting 48% in 2014? Or like his brother Chris, getting up to 48, 49, 50% like he did in 2016 and 2018? That's going to be the question. The polling thus far, not to overreact to one Republican-affiliated poll, but it does show, at least so far, that Sununu probably gives the Republicans a slightly better chance of winning than Scott Brown. The question will be, how does the Republican primary play out? As for the general election, my most recent prediction, I do have the Democrats as lean favorites in New Hampshire. This is in between a 1 and 5 point Democratic win, because I do think if it's Pappas versus Sununu, I don't think this is going to be more than a 5-point Democratic win. I think it's going to be kind of under the radar a little bit for how competitive this race is going to be. I do think the Democrats would narrowly hold on and win it, and I think Chris Pappas is a very strong, formidable Democratic candidate, but I do think Sununu makes this race a lot closer, so much so that it would fall under 5 points. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.